Good evening, everybody. This is Jacqueline Lukeman, and welcome to another installment of the rebooted Brick by Brick. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. I apologize for the long absence, but there's been a lot going on in Lukeman Nation, and Brick by Brick needed some time off to gather some more information, to do some more research, and to really get us on this journey of understanding where the political black left came from. So if you remember in the last episode that we did quite a few months ago, we talked extensively about Marcus Garvey and his indelible influence on the black left political movement. Now it's been a while, so tonight I want to start with a short recap of Marcus Garvey and how important he is still to the movement of black political leftism. So I first want to call attention to something pretty obvious. If you remember the last episode, I talked about how Marcus Garvey famously said, "Liberate the minds of men, and ultimately you will liberate the bodies of men." And as a matter of fact, Marcus Garvey's ideology was immortalized in Bob Marley's song, Redemption Song. It's important to note in relation to the current events going on with a certain previously popular rapper, that the idea of liberating the black man's mind is not new. But here's something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the difference between people like Marcus Garvey saying, "Liberate the minds of men and you will liberate their bodies," and the difference between someone like Kanye West saying it, is that Marcus Garvey dedicated his life to building the infrastructure and creating apparatus and creating opportunities through which black people could liberate themselves. This is not something that can be said of Kanye West or any self-help, do-it-yourself entrepreneurship black guru today. It is absolutely true that Marcus Garvey advocated economic self-determination for black people. His most spectacular undertaking was the creation of an all-Negro steamship company called the Black Star Line. Now, although this project is often reputed to have been intended to be a way to transport black people to Africa to resettle, something that Marcus Garvey was never shy about saying that he wished black people would do, but he also said that not all black people would make it in Africa because not all of us would be worth anything there because some of us weren't worth anything here. Garvey was always the ultimate realist. He actually intended the Black Star Line to be a profitable commercial operation. It was meant to create justifiable racial pride by demonstrating black commercial and nautical skill. Now, Marcus Garvey established the Negro Factories Corporation also and offered stock for African Americans to buy into the corporation. He wanted to produce everything that African Americans needed to completely rely upon their own efforts. The Negro Factories Corporation generated income and provided jobs through its numerous enterprises, including a chain of grocery stores and restaurants, steam laundry, tailor shop, dressmaking shop, a millinery, and a publishing house, and a doll factory. Garvey had such strong separatist and purity sentiments that he even tried to make an alliance with the Ku Klux Klan. As Garvey put it, quote, "While the Ku Klux Klan desires to make America absolutely a white man's country, the UNIA desires to make Africa absolutely a black man's country." End quote. Because of Garvey's separatist ideologies, but more so because he met with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan and actually got a promise of monetary support from the head of the Ku Klux Klan at the time, Garvey was strongly criticized by black leaders of that day, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who at the time called Garvey the greatest enemy of the Negro race. The Urban League called Garvey a swindler. And black union leader A. Philip Randolph said that Garvey and Garveyism should be purged from American soil. All of this was in response to Marcus Garvey making an alliance with the head of the Ku Klux Klan. And that alliance was to get financial backing to repatriate African Americans back to Africa who wanted to go. Now, at this time also, various civil rights organizations at the time mounted a coordinated Garvey Must Go campaign that was very public. And it was very acrimonious and very nasty in black newspapers. And believe that at that time, white society took notice of the rift between black people. Because it was then that the Justice Department, seeing its opportunity to discredit Garvey amid his growing popularity, if you recall, the United Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization, boasted an enrollment of 11 million black people in America alone. So the Justice Department wanted to thwart the growth and influence of this movement among the black masses, among the black working class and poor. So they seized upon the criticism from mainstream black leaders to focus on Garvey, and the Justice Department hired its first black officer solely to infiltrate the UNIA. And that's highlighted because I hope that sounds familiar. That's the precursor to federal law enforcement's programs to discredit black organizations. Garvey's economic infrastructure for black people they weren't faring so well, partially through his own lack of financial management practices, his own staff's inexperience in the shipping business, along with the lack of knowledge of investments, which led to Garvey and his organization buying unworthy ships at inflated prices. And this, of course, affected the success of the Black Star Line, but it should also be noted that shipping companies and the owners of shipping companies weren't exactly getting in line to do good and honest business with black nationalist, pro-black Marcus Garvey. So they absolutely took advantage of his lack of knowledge. Also, economic and political oppression of black consumer base, the very people that Garvey wanted to help with his ventures, were constantly under attack economically and politically in America, and the targeting of Garvey and the UNIA by federal law enforcement all converged to contribute to the failure of the Negro Factories Corporation businesses and the Black Star Line. Garvey and 3 other members of the UNIA were charged with conspiracy to use the mail to defraud, which is a federal offense, by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation was called just the Bureau of Investigation. Both J. Edgar Hoover's career and the FBI's career were new and fledgling at this time. And J. Edgar Hoover started his career targeting black activists. The charges against the other 3 members of UNIA were dropped, but Garvey was convicted by an all-white jury on charges that were widely considered then and still today politically motivated, and in a trial that was tainted by misconduct. Garvey was convicted in 1923. He was imprisoned in 1925, and he was deported to Jamaica in 1927. Marcus Garvey died in London in 1940. And as recently as 2016, his son and other family members were still fighting to clear his name of the charges of mail fraud to this day. It's important to understand Marcus Garvey's lasting influence on the global struggle for Black liberation and for Black politics, because Garvey's movement was the first Black attempt to join modern urban goals to mass organization. Although most subsequent leaders really didn't try to recreate Black economic institutions like Garvey did, Marcus Garvey had demonstrated to Black people that the urban masses, not the educated Black elite alone, were a powerful force in the struggle for Black freedom. Because up until Marcus Garvey, the Black elite pretty much ignored the Black masses, the Black working class, the Black poor, and used the Black educated elite as the standard for Black leadership, the examples for Black leadership, where Marcus Garvey used the Black masses as Black leadership. While Garvey promoted self-reliance over political involvement, he is the only Black leader in the 20th century to establish a framework and infrastructure specifically for Black people toward that goal. Flawed though his ventures were, UNIA's business ventures were created by Garvey to provide everyday goods and services to Black people for Black people, something that today's advocates of self-reliance cannot claim and have not done. Marcus Garvey has inspired every major Black movement of the 20th century all over the world. Followers of Garvey's ideology in the United States include the late Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Minister Louis Farrakhan, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. UNIA also penetrated all over Africa, particularly and most notably South Africa, because UNIA was present at the birth of the African National Congress. Several African independent state leaders, such as Nnamdi Ezekwe, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Nelson Mandela, Patrice Lumumba, and Julius Nyerere were Garveyites. The United Negro Improvement Association was not a blip in the timeline of Black struggle. Marcus Garvey's ideology, his movement, his organization, his principles spread around the world and live on today in the legacies of not just his accomplishments, but the accomplishments of every Black leader he influenced. And those Black leaderships have reshaped and advanced Black struggle throughout all of these years. And that includes the Civil Rights Movement, which, interestingly enough, in the United States is probably one of the most misunderstood, watered down, and whitewashed Black liberation movements that we ever talk about. Let me show you why. Let's talk about the real civil rights movement, the birth and the focus of the real civil rights movement. Because contrary to popular understanding, the civil rights movement began much earlier than the 1950s and the 1960s. That's the way we understand it in this country. The NAACP's anti-lynching campaign of the 1930s combined widespread publicity about the causes and costs of lynching, both economic and social, and a successful drive to defeat a white supremacist and anti-union Supreme Court nominee named John J. Parker, and then defeat the senators who voted for his confirmation. And the NAACP's campaign combined a skillful effort to lobby Congress and the Roosevelt administration to pass a federal anti-lynching law. I hope those issues that are highlighted seem familiar to you. Because how many politicians do we have running in various primaries and state and local races today, even national, who are white supremacists or who are sympathetic to white supremacist ideology? How long have we been dealing with anti-union politicians? And how long have we been trying to defeat the senators who vote for these people's confirmation? Well, for many people in the progressive movement, this is a new fight. But for those of us who have grown up from the civil rights movement, this is a fight we have been involved in since at least the 1930s. This struggle is not new to African Americans. As a matter of fact, the anti-lynching campaign of the NAACP was so public that outside of the New York offices, whenever a man was lynched anywhere in the United States, they would hang a flag, this flag, outside of the window of their office, announcing to the world that a crime against humanity, a crime against African Americans that was not being paid attention to or prosecuted by the United States government, a man was lynched yesterday. And that flag has been amended for modern struggles to read a man or a woman or a child was lynched by the police yesterday. But the anti-lynching campaign is actually older than the NAACP's campaign of 1930. Because before the NAACP launched their successful anti-lynching campaign that did result in federal anti-lynching legislation, Ida B. Wells was the first anti-lynching advocate to publish accounts of lynchings, bringing the horrendous crimes against black men, women, and children to the public fore on a regular basis as early as 1892. Ida B. Wells was a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. And this is her Southern Horrors pamphlet, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. She said, quote, "It is with no pleasure that I have dipped my hands in the corruption here exposed. Somebody must show that the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning, and it seems to have fallen upon me to do so." End quote. She said that. She wrote that in 1892. Now, Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign did not result in successful federal anti-lynching legislation, which is why the NAACP was still fighting for federal anti-lynching legislation in 1930. But we can never forget that before these famous and organizations that easily come to the top of our minds, like the NAACP, before these organizations existed, there were people doing the work who are very often not given the credit they are due. And very frequently, those people were women. Women played a much larger role in the civil rights movement than many people even understand they did. For example, Ida B. Wells and her help with founding the NAACP contributed to the organization not just focusing on the balance of power, or rather not just focusing on integration and anti-lynching laws. The NAACP also focused on addressing the balance of power, or the imbalance of power, between employers and workers, as did the larger civil rights movement. These organizations paid special attention to organized labor, whose history of racial exclusion angered blacks, yes, as early as the 1930s and actually earlier. The National Negro Congress brought blacks into the newly formed United Steelworkers Organization, and the union then were forced to pay attention to the particular demands of African Americans. And then the NAACP assisted the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the largest black labor organization of its day. In the 1940s, the United Auto Workers, with the NAACP's encouragement, made overtures to black workers. Recognizing the interdependence of domestic and foreign affairs, the NAACP's program, as early in the 1920s and 30s, promoted solidarity with Haitians who were trying to end the American military occupation and with colonized blacks elsewhere in the Caribbean and in Africa. This came from African American support for the war effort in World War II, and the battle against the master race ideology abroad that was matched by equal determination to eradicate the master race ideology that existed in America. Let's not forget that the largest Nazi rally outside of Germany occurred in Times Square, Madison Square Garden in New York City. In the post-World War II years, blacks supported the decolonization of Africa and Asia. So it was people like Ida B. Wells and her focus on not just anti-lynching laws, but the rights and freedom of black people in labor and all over the world that expanded the NAACP's mission beyond just pushing for integration. Now, of course, everyone talks about Martin Luther King Jr. when they talk about the civil rights movement. But without Ella Baker, another woman who doesn't get much credit for her role in the civil rights movement, there would not have been a Southern Christian Leadership Conference at all. Ella Baker began her involvement with the NAACP in 1940. She worked as a field secretary and then served as director of branches from 1943 until 1946. In 1957, Baker moved to Atlanta to help organize Martin Luther King Jr.'s new organization, the SCLC. She also ran a voter registration campaign called the Crusade for Citizenship. Had Ella Baker not moved to Atlanta in 1957 and not helped Martin Luther King Jr. organize the SCLC, there would not have been an SCLC. Baker left the SCLC after the Greensboro sit-ins, though, to assist new student activists because she viewed the young emerging activists who were getting involved in the civil rights movement as a resource and an asset to the movement. So from her organizing experience with the SCLC, Ella Baker organized a meeting at Shaw University for the student leaders of the sit-ins in April 1960. And from that meeting, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was born. Without Ella Baker, there would not have been an SCLC. Without an SCLC, there would not have been a SNCC. In adopting the Gandhian theory of nonviolent direct action, SNCC members joined with activists from the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, to organize the 1961 Freedom Rides. And in 1964, SNCC helped create Freedom Summer, an effort to focus national attention on Mississippi's racism and to register black voters. Quite simply, without Ella Baker, there would not have been an SCLC. Without an SCLC, there would not have been a SNCC. Without a SNCC, there would not have been the 1961 Freedom Rides. And were there no 1961 Freedom Rides, there would never have been the Freedom Summer of 1964. All because of one woman organizing the SCLC, helping Martin Luther King Jr. out. This is Ella Baker, one of my personal heroes. As pivotal as Martin Luther King Jr. was to the civil rights movement for his powerful and eloquent oratory, without Ella Baker, the SCLC, SNCC, and Freedom Summer would not have been realities. Ella Baker said that the struggle for justice for black people in America was, quote, concerned with something much bigger than a hamburger or even a giant-sized Coke, end quote. Sit-ins and protests were about more than raising awareness and changing the hearts of whites. When the sit-ins swept Atlanta in 1960, protesters' demands included jobs, health care, reform of the police and the criminal justice system, education, and the vote. Do any of those sound familiar? Are we still not fighting for those things today? As I said earlier, the fight for these things in American politics is new to the current wave of progressive activists. But for those of us who know our history and the history of black struggle and the real history of the real civil rights movement, we know that black people have been fighting for jobs, health care, reform of the police and criminal justice system, education, and the free and unfettered vote for decades. Demonstrations in Birmingham in 1963 under the leadership of Fred Shuttlesworth's Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, which was affiliated with the SCLC, demanded not only an end to segregation in downtown stores, but also jobs for African Americans in those businesses and municipal government. The 1963 March on Washington, most often remembered as the event at which Dr. King proclaimed his dream, was actually a demonstration for jobs and justice. And it is absolutely worth noting that many of the organizations involved in the civil rights movement, in the real civil rights movement that isn't talked about in any kind of honest detail, were faith-based organizations led by black people, many in the South. So the current disdain for people of faith in the progressive or leftist movements is not even an historically accurate representation of the black struggle for liberation in this country. Now let's talk about what the real civil rights movement really did cover, because it was much more expansive and radical than we admit. You see, despite the watered down and whitewashed view of the civil rights movement we memorialize today, the goals of everyone involved were not limited to the simplistic ideals of just getting along between black and white people, but they were instead focused on real solutions to real problems of domestic, racial, and economic oppression, international solidarity with other oppressed people, and the elimination of global imperialism and militarism. Even in the 60s, the civil rights movement was not just about integrating lunch counters. But all everyone remembers of Martin Luther King Jr. when they think of the civil rights movement is that he had a dream. But not only do people not read or listen to the entire speech from the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, but they also don't listen to or read any of Martin Luther King Jr.'s other speeches. Because Martin Luther King also called for a guaranteed annual income, the redistribution of the national wealth to meet human needs, and an end to a war to colonize the Vietnamese. Martin Luther King Jr. is always and only remembered today for having a dream that one day his little children would walk hand in hand with white children, and his children would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. He's remembered for his nonviolence. He's remembered for dreaming. But Martin Luther King Jr. was very politically aware of the work that still needed to be done even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a quote from his speech in May of 1967. He said, "And because we are moving into this new phase after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, some people feel that the civil rights movement is dead. The new phase is a struggle for genuine equality. It is now a struggle for genuine equality on all levels, and this will be a much more difficult struggle. You see, the gains in the first period, that was the Civil Rights Act, or the first era of struggle, were obtained from the power structure at bargain rates. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate hotels and motels. It didn't cost the nation a penny to guarantee the right to vote. Now we are in a period where it will cost the nation billions of dollars to get rid of poverty, to get rid of slums, to make quality integrated education a reality. The fact is that there has never been any single solid, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans to genuine equality for Negroes. There has always been ambivalence. Now let us be sure that we will have to keep the pressure alive. We've never made any gain in civil rights without constant, persistent, legal, and nonviolent pressure. Don't let anybody make you feel that the problem will work itself out." Those are words from Martin Luther King Jr., the nonviolent, peaceful Messiah that so many white people who still do not want to confront the fact that racism is one of the three evils that King identified back in the 60s as the problem that white people, the federal government, local governments must confront if America is to become the society that we say we are on paper, in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights. Racism, militarism, and poverty are the three evils that Martin Luther King Jr. constantly and frequently spoke against in public after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And in this one passage, in this one speech, King makes it clear that the work of the civil rights movement was not completed. There was much more work to be done. But that's not how we present him. That's not how we present the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King Jr. is not the only icon from that period that we misrepresent in our retelling of this very important and very rich history of radical Black political and social action. We all remember Brother El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, or Malcolm X, uttering the famous words, quote, "This is a case of the chickens coming home to roost," end quote, in response to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Nope, I misspelled that. I'll fix that before I publish it. But what people do not remember from the very same comment on the very same day from Malcolm X was that Malcolm noted that the United States government was engaged in targeted assassinations of foreign leaders, especially and specifically pointing to the murder of Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. Remember, Patrice Lumumba was a Garveyite, a beneficiary and an heir, and a standard bearer in the modern era at that time in Africa of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Malcolm X noted then that the United States played a prominent role in the destabilization of Lumumba's government in 1960, as well as his kidnapping, torture, and execution in January 1961. Does this sound familiar? I can't help but continue to point out that the things many progressives of today are coming to realize and understand about our government and the crimes our government has committed against other governments is new to these progressives who have just become politically aware since 2016, but Black people who are beneficiaries of the legacy of the civil rights movement, who have grown up into and matured from the political message and direction of the Black nationalist and radicalism of the civil rights movement from Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Ella Baker and Shuttlesworth. We've known that our government has been interfering in the independent governments of other nations for decades. This fight is new to you. We've been fighting it for years. But if you notice, our leaders who have led this fight are dead. These are the words of Malcolm X from his famous ballot or the bullet speech. He says, so those of us whose political and economic and social philosophy is black nationalism have become involved in the civil rights struggle, immediately dispelling the notion that black nationalists such as Malcolm X and his followers wanted nothing to do with the civil rights movement. That was not true. He said, we have injected ourselves into the civil rights struggle and we intend to expand it from the level of civil rights to the level of human rights. So our next move is to take the entire civil rights struggle problem into the United Nations and let the world see that Uncle Sam is guilty of violating the human rights of 22 million Afro-Americans right down to the year of 1964. In 1964, you can't even get a civil rights legislation. And this man, who is Uncle Sam, has got the nerve to stand up and talk about South Africa or talk about Nazi Germany or talk about Portugal. No, no more days like those. The only way we're going to solve it, we've got to unite. We've got to work together in unity and harmony. He is speaking to an audience of largely black people. And black nationalism is the key. How are we going to overcome the tendency to be at each other's throats that always exists in our own neighborhood? And the reason this tendency exists, the strategy of the white man has always been divide and conquer. He keeps us divided in order to conquer us. Keeps us fighting with each other. No, I'm not for separation and you're not for integration. What you and I are for is freedom. Those who have the power and the money to dictate history have watered down the history, the rich and the radical history of the civil rights movement, the women, the men, the children, the organizations, the expansiveness, the international focus, the economic focus, the union focus, the worker focus, the women-powered focus, the influence of gay men and women in the civil rights movement. Those who have had the power and the influence to do it have watered down the history, the rich and radical history of the civil rights movement. But those of us who know and wish to honor that history and understand its connection to our continued struggle today can never and will never let that whitewashing continue. This is why Brick by Brick exists. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s was therefore not concerned exclusively with interracial cooperation or harmony. It wasn't exclusively concerned with segregation and discrimination as a character issue. The civil rights movement was not focusing on addressing white people's moral failings and fixing that. Rather, as in earlier decades, the focus and the goal of the civil rights movement was a redefinition of American society and a redistribution of social and economic power to include the descendants of enslaved Africans previously denied legal, social, and economic equality and mobility in what was rightfully ours, which was the full and unconditional citizenship in this country we built. The civil rights movement was not just a focus on cleansing and reworking white America's soul. It was focused on reordering American society to be just and equal for all. Period. So now we get to the part of the history of the civil rights movement where we see clearly the connection between the Black Power movement that came in the late 60s, early 70s, after what we were told in our history classes was the quote-unquote end of the formal civil rights movement. But as we'll see in our next installment, it wasn't the end, it was just a continuing of the same struggle, because Stokely Carmichael led SNCC and worked with Martin Luther King Jr. Carmichael saw the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, especially in urban areas, and it was in fact Stokely Carmichael who coined the phrase Black Power. And in our next installment, we'll look at a few of the aspects of the dynamics of how Martin Luther King Jr. viewed Black Power, because his views changed over time. And we'll look at how the shortfalls of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 led to the rise of Black Power movements. Because the government did not fully implement the Civil Rights Act, and Republicans and some Democrats actively fought to dismantle it from before the day it was signed, actually. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not fully address discrimination against Black people on all fronts. We'll talk about how urban poverty and discrimination was especially persistent even in light of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Just a quick note, Black enrollment in colleges did increase after the Civil Rights Act. Black hiring in government jobs in the private sector did increase. Black home ownership did increase. So there was some progress. But that progress was very, very limited. And the improvement and that progress did not reach all Black people, specifically in urban areas and specifically among the poor. And in our next installment of The Rise of the Political Black Left, we will talk about the rise of the Black Power movements to address those poor Black masses who were left behind by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I hope we'll be able to show you that the civil rights movement never ended. It never died. It was never concerned with redeeming the soul or reforming the soul of white America, but it was always focused on reordering American society to include the Black masses that it intentionally left behind. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. I hope you learned something that you did not know before. I hope you share this episode, and please join us next week. Look out for the announcement for the next installment of Brick by Brick with me, Jacqueline Luqman, where we'll continue to talk about the rise of the political Black left, and we'll talk about Black Power next time. Thank y'all so much for joining me. Good night.
Building it brick by